Hi, hello, and welcome back to UCU Commons Coffee. This is a space for conversations about the commons, both in union organising and in higher education and research more generally. Our context in the UK right now for the HE Commons is one of redundancies, swinging cuts to entire teaching programmes, especially in the social sciences and the humanities, as well as cuts to research budgets on a national level. So to speak to that, we are really, really thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Lata Narayanaswamy. Lata is Associate Professor in the Politics of Global Development at the University of Leeds and is going to talk to us about the UKRI, that's UK Research and Innovation cuts, and the future of research funding in the UK. So welcome, Lata. I'm really, really pleased that you made the time to join us. So thanks so much for that. So for the benefit of everybody listening, could you just tell me a bit about yourself and what you work on?
Yes, for sure. So thank you for having me. I hope you can hear me.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I actually am involved very broadly in gender and development is sort of my background in terms of research. I've had the privilege since joining Leeds of being involved in a number of, I guess, what you call interdisciplinary projects. And that's been a really nice thing about being involved in some of the bigger sorts of funding streams where you're sort of working with colleagues to say, okay, well, how do we bring our different elements of research together? So as a result of that, I did end up being involved in ODA funded GCRF, which is, I know, what we'll be talking about. And that's been related to water security. So I'm not a water security specialist at all. But it was about saying, okay, well, how do we think about the issues around, say, gender, power, and intersectionality, and what does that have to do with water security? So there was quite a good and robust conversation that there was the potential to have in that space. I also work with colleagues in media and communications, and with colleagues at the University of Nairobi and University of Ghana on climate change mitigation, gender and Indigenous knowledge. So the essence of that work is really to start from the point where we think about women and rural women as expert knowledge holders rather than victims of climate change, and that's again just really lovely to sort of chat to colleagues and get to know them, and then think about how we can sort of upend the narratives around victimization that actually tend also to be applied disproportionately to rural women in the global south, as it were. So into both those projects, I've now been involved in the last 2 weeks in these conversations about cuts to funding, and we got one award for the climate change and gender project where the funding was just withdrawn. So I have been at the sharp end of all of this. Yeah, it was AHRC funding, and we got the award, and they said, well, actually, we can't honor it. So those are the sorts of things.
Wow.
Yeah. And in terms of other areas that I work on, all of that is always thinking about that from, say, like, whose knowledge counts, decolonization. And so there's real opportunities to sort of have those conversations with colleagues, not just in our own context, but in the global south. The richness of those dialogues is valuable in sort of trying to think about what a more progressive development agenda looks like. And it does feel a little bit like having the rug pulled from under you.
Absolutely, I'm sure it does. So for the benefit of those that might not be
I think I might have lost you, Tilly. I can't hear you, Eric.
Hi, I'm Eric, just behind the scenes, but I think Tilly's internet may have dropped. But I was following along, and it's an absolutely as you said, it's really having the rug pulled out from under you.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
is it one of the largest cuts to funding ever, really?
Well, I mean, the thing is that even if I think the frustration has been nobody's underestimating the challenges of being in COVID. Nobody underestimates the ways in which we may have to have a dialogue about what we can and cannot do in that context. But this feels a little bit spurious in the context for a number of reasons. So the first is obviously this government has found what they would call their magic money tree for all sorts of things, right? So we've had money thrown at, say, test and trace that just isn't resolving the way in which we manage the pandemic, which is of course money that has to be spent, but then you expect it to be spent well. The frustration with these cuts is as compared to lots of things that were spent on so let's think about Eat Out to Help Out, which of course has now been shown to have actually accelerated the pandemic last autumn. That is about 6 times the amount of money. That costs 6 times the amount of money that this funding cut gives the government. This is 120 million pounds. It's nothing in the scheme of things, but that 120 million pounds was absolutely crucial income for universities. In terms of the partnerships that they've built, the ways in which we work internationally, the sorts of challenges that we're trying to work with other international partners on. I don't even see what that 100, I don't even see that amount of money, which in the scale of the government's budgets is so minuscule. I don't see what problems it solves, but it creates problems. And the challenge even is there could have been a discussion. Nobody is against a discussion about what we do with aid. And actually aid in any way, and I have to say this, aid is politically problematic. The idea that somehow the global north has answers to the world's problems is a colonial era trope that we need to be challenging. But lots of us in good faith have entered into these funding arrangements, sought out these partnerships, built trust and faith with global partners to at least try to make the most of these resources in ways that do genuinely speak to the challenges that we're facing as best as we can. And there is a conversation to be had about whether this is the best way to spend money. For me, actually, the biggest challenge has been the deeply unprofessional way that these cuts have been handled. You could even say to people, look, you know what, this is the challenge. We're going to cut this or that budget. We have to reimagine what we're doing. So let's talk with universities. Let's talk with these hubs. Let's talk with research programs. Let's work out, how we manage going forward. But everybody I've spoken to has been very clear that cutting at this rate, at this speed, so in other words, how much has been cut and the speed at which the cuts have come down has been unprecedented. Literally nobody had this as part of their contingency planning. And the difficulty is, this isn't just about money. This isn't just about, oh, well, maybe we're not going to be able to support working towards SDG 6 or whatever. I mean, those are important things, but we can have discussions about the value of the SDGs. I mean, these are not politically neutral issues. But actually, the human cost of this for an amount of money that, I'm sorry, it just doesn't feel like it's important enough. It doesn't seem to meet. It's not like that 120 million is sort of very obviously going to go towards something else. It's so for change on the scale of the amount of money that's been spent in this pandemic, which needed to be spent. I'm not suggesting it shouldn't have been. But the human cost of terminating contracts at this kind of short notice. And I've just been hearing story after story, people who left good permanent jobs to join these research hubs, who moved their families from other countries, people who are now, having to have the uncertainty of short-term contracts. Some people were like, I don't even know if I'm going to get paid at the end of April, like now. This to me seems, completely unnecessary. And I would say that by and large, I feel that universities have at least tried to step up. The conversations that universities are having have been variable. There has been some sectoral commitment to think about how we manage job loss. But all of this has just been done in a way that it doesn't serve objectives. And certainly in the context of Brexit Britain, which is the context that we're in, regardless of what we think of those commitments and where our own politics lie, and all of us will have a different view on that, if in fact we're going to take at face value commitments to global Britain, I just don't see how this helps anything. How are we, in good faith, supposed to go to a future partner, to people we've worked with, relationships that we've built trust over many years, and said, you know what, we cut 70% of the funding last time, but please come and work with us again. And yet Kwasi Kwarteng has gone to the select committee and said, oh, well, no, I don't really think it's had a huge impact on our standing in the world or partnerships. It's like, come along, I'll give you some examples of the ways in which it's devastating livelihoods, is creating huge amounts of uncertainty. And for what? So for me, it's that frustration. There were and lots of people in this space have been quite clear about that. We are really happy for there to be a conversation about how we spend aid. Should we even be spending aid? There are lots of people in the sector happy to have that conversation. This doesn't serve anybody's purposes. It done in this way, it doesn't solve anything. It doesn't help anybody. It is thoughtless and unprofessional and deeply frustrating. So I have the luxury of being in a permanent job, and in the midst of this pandemic, that feels like an enormous privilege. But I'm standing by, watching the human cost of this play out, and I'm devastated and powerless, and it's frustrating beyond belief. I can't tell you.
Yeah, I've been able to see from well, among other things, some of the thoughts that colleagues have been sharing on social media about this, and just how kind of far to the end of everybody's tether that they are at, and a couple of things I want to follow up with what you just said. I mean, like you said, this is the context of Brexit Britain.
Yeah.
And one might think that having kind of detached itself from the EU and the EU's kind of like, well, the kind of the regulatory embrace of the EU, and also kind of starting out a new, like, kind of charting a new path for the UK in the world. The UK might think, right, we have to kind of prioritize keeping productive and kind of mutually trusting relationships with other countries, especially in the context of there being a kind of global crisis, global health crisis, global economic crisis, and also global climate crisis. But yet they are still going down this path of cutting overseas aid. I mean, the overseas aid budget has long been a kind of like, it's long been a kind of culture war drum that conservative governments have banged, and they've been encouraged in that by the likes of kind of, well, like the UKIPs of the world, right? And like, have you got any thoughts about that? Like,
I mean, it is a really important point. And I remember actually, in during the whole Brexit debate, there were all these vox pops. It's an example I share with students all the time. So there were these vox pops around people who were going to be supporting Brexit, and they were supporting UKIP. And there was this one, and it's really stuck in my mind. I remember this woman was interviewed. She says, "Oh, I don't know why we send all this money overseas when we've got people starving at home."
Absolutely, that is the thing, isn't it?
We need an answer to that.
Yeah.
So this is somebody that has correctly identified the right problem, and then has come up with the entirely wrong solution. Which, again, my proviso here is I'm not suggesting that there isn't a conversation to be had about aid generally, right?
Absolutely, of course.
Colonial era kind of hangover. There's all these discussions to have, and I'm very happy to have them. But what this woman was describing was a sense of a sort of resource scarcity that was underpinned by the idea that resource distribution is a zero-sum game.
Yes.
And it really, and the conversation that we need to be having is, how do we disentangle the structural causes of the problems that she's identified, right? So so in my mind, it's like, okay, you know what, you're right. But the question isn't, why do we send money overseas? Which is a conversation, is entirely separate to the fact that people might be starving in our own context. This is the fact that people are starving in our own context is a monumental failure of governance in the 6th richest country in the history of the world. That's the conversation we need to be having. Overseas aid, whatever its politics and its good and its ill, is a drop in the ocean compared to the squandering of resources, the very poor resource distribution we have in our own very, very wealthy Western context. But because you get the sort of very simplified narratives, right? And immigration was the same. Everything gets presented as a kind of zero-sum game. If that group is doing well, then that must mean I'm not doing so well. So whether that's immigrants are taking my job or taking up school place, it's always the same sort of very divisive kind of rhetoric that is pitting groups against each other in this sense that actually the pool of resource is limited. And this is that goes back to my point about this magic money tree, which is one of those it's one of those phrases I don't like, but it is a really good way to sort of encapsulate why that is just so hypocritical. Because when this government, any government in the last, as long as you have your own central bank, the fact is, if there's something you want to spend money on, the money is clearly found. Right. So whether that's you want to run a minority government, well, I'm going to find £1 billion to give to the DUP.
A bung for the DUP.
Absolutely. I want to find money for, I don't know, what are they going to do? A festival of Brexit. Isn't the estimated cost of that something like £150 million? We're going to support hospitality. Do you know what? Actually, eat out to help out. I'm not suggesting for a second that there isn't a conversation to be had about supporting the service sector. So at that level, I'm like, yeah, okay. But wouldn't it have been better if you're thinking about marrying the science and the economy to actually pay people to stay home? So we can have a conversation about what we spend money on. What all of that points to for me, though, is that there is money if you want to find it. This is and this is the 6th richest country. Well, it was until Brexit, the 5th one. But I think there's always some sort of jostling in that 5th and 6th place between sort of France, Germany, and the UK. But the fact is, it's not even like it's now. It's like the 5th richest country, like the history of the universe. So the fact that we're failing our own people within our own borders is a failure of our systems of governance. But the fact then that then people sort of see that as, okay, well, because the corollary of that or what's going on in that woman's head, to go back to the Vox Pop, is she's thinking, okay, well, if we don't send money overseas, that money will get spent here. Which I think
the government has no intention of that.
No, not at all. And Nigel Farage is not doing that because he thinks that's what should happen.
No,
this is the guy that wants to privatize the NHS. So, but you can't have those conversations because they're very deeply felt in the way that people engage with them, and it's not always rational, right? It's not always about, okay, well, if people have the best information, then they're going to make a rational. That's not how that woman was.
Not how it works. I think if we've learned anything since 2016, that's not how it works, I guess.
Not at all.
Yeah. Oh God, yes. Well, another thing you mentioned I wanted to bring up was this kind of how this has shattered relationships of trust and the working relationships that researchers and practitioners and academics in the UK had spent years building up with partners in partner countries and in partner institutions. Can you elaborate a bit more on this, do you think?
Yeah, of course. I mean, so there's so many things to say in this space. One of the things that's really quite ironic, I guess, is that a big push in the way that we've been thinking. So even in thinking about overseas development aid, so spending, the rules that govern that, you get sort of the guidance that comes with so I suppose it struck me that we didn't really talk about so this is Global Challenges Research Fund tied with overseas development aid. So the context is simply that for those of you who are listening who don't really know what we're talking about, it's a bit late in the day, but better late than never, which is to say there is a commitment by Western governments to commit 0.7% of GNI to overseas aid, and the UK,
that's gross national income. Sorry.
Yes. So the UK has actually been one of the few countries that does or more or less meets that target in a way that the Australias and the Canadas are sort of middling at kind of 0.1, 0.2. And one of the sort of to not put too fine a point on it, the global soft power innovations of New Labour was the creation of DFID. And again, there's a whole politics around that. There's the conversations to be had. I'm not the person to suggest that that solves anything. But there was a commitment to spend this money to sort of do that. And then when we got to the to 2015, there was a way, one of the things that came out of that was to say, okay, well, is there a way for ODA to be spent on research? Because the guidance around ODA that comes from the OECD is that overseas development assistance shouldn't be about benefiting the country that is giving the aid, effectively. It has to be driven by research agendas in the global south.
Yes.
So this money was being so ODA, badged as ODA, was being filtered through the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. So BEES, people may have heard that being talked about in the news, or
one of those weird government department names that no one quite knows how to say.
You may have seen the acronym. So that's BEIS.
Yes.
And this was a pot of money, 1.5 billion pounds between 2016 and 2021, was meant to be spent on effectively research to support tackling global challenges. That was the language. So at the heart of that, so we could think about this, right? So this comes online in 2016. And I remember being within my own university, at the University of Leeds, being in these early briefings, right? So again, 1.5 billion over 5 years spread across n number of institutions isn't actually that much money. But if you're a researcher sitting in a briefing and somebody says, oh, there's a 1.5 billion pound pot of money, I mean, it was unfathomable, right? There's nothing that gets that kind of money.
No.
So there were lots of people who thought, oh, there's a pot of money, so maybe I can adapt my research. There's lots of, there are bad faith actors in higher education as well. But by and large, I remember just, linking with people. So I say, okay, well, look, I already work with so-and-so in this country on something. I already work with that person in that country. And this is 2016. So we are 1 year into the SDGs. So for those of you who don't know, that's the Sustainable Development Goals. That is the overarching framework that came out of that sits within the UN. And it's the successor to the Millennium Development Goals, which, clues in the name, came about in the millennium. 8 goals then turned in 2015 into 17 goals. And actually why that's important, the details sort of less important in the sense of what the goals are, the sort of, zero poverty and, goals around education and gender equality and et cetera, climate action. But what's important is that they have been at the heart of shaping a lot of this activity, right? We have been having to speak to the SDGs and all of our funding, but that's been very much at the heart of that. But we've got this pot of money, and it's about global challenges. And the ODA, the advice is very clear. It has to be driven by global south priorities, right? It cannot be about benefiting the UK. That's the guidance that we get in writing these funding bids.
Yeah, well, fair enough.
Yeah, well, no, we're right. But by definition, then,
right. Yeah.
So this is a very roundabout way to get to the point that the question you asked me. So, which is that at the heart, then, implicit in that is partnership.
Yes.
I can't write a bid if somebody is not telling me what their priority is. So that is then about partnerships with whoever. That could be NGOs in the global south. That could be academic partners. So as I said, I have the privilege of working with fantastic partners at the University of Nairobi in Kenya and in Ghana. But those are relationships that are built off of the back of the PI on our project, who's had those relationships over many years. So this pot of money wasn't about, I'm going to go look for people. Very often it was this kind of thing, which is, oh, I already know that person. And now this pot of money is available and they were putting out calls. This is a way for me to strengthen that partnership. This is a way for me to amplify that colleague's work. This is a way for me to work on issues that they think are important and I can support them. So these are the sorts of conversations that were happening. But you literally built into this money that this 1.5 billion pounds could not be spent without partners in the global south. Partnership was it. That was at the heart of it. So all the projects I've been involved in that are GCRF are about partnership, about amplifying the things that colleagues in a range of global south institutions and NGOs are telling us, because that's what we were supposed to do. So then if you turn around and you anybody who's, either Tilly yourself or anybody's listening, who's done a funding application, who understands what it means to get the money, and then you think, oh, that's great. And then you've got to write your budget and do it. You know how time consuming that is. Where are we going to allocate the resource? What is everybody going to do? What are the time scales for that? And you spend the time to do that. So the water hub, the security, water security GCRF hub that I'm involved in, I'm like one teeny tiny slice of a 17 million pounds. 17 million, that would be a bit overwhelming, wouldn't it? 17 million pound pot of money with around 48 partners spread across Colombia, Ethiopia, India, Malaysia, and the UK. That takes time. The only way to make that make sense is if at least I know that the budget is fixed, that I know what I'm spending, that I know what resource I have.
Yeah, well, it's sort of a bare minimum, isn't it?
Well, yeah. So, and this again is done in good faith. Of all the things, of all the contingencies that people planned for, nobody was thinking, oh, okay, well, I'm going to put together the budget and I'm going to work out everybody get, and then in a 2-week period, I'm going to have to find 70% to cut out of my budget, which is exactly what happened. And you're like, so you've got this pot of money. You may have changed your mind, but this is what I mean about, even if you wanted to make this cut, even if you felt for a country that can print its own money, there is no logical reason why, even if you want to make an argument that the cut was necessary, that it has to happen in 2 weeks. There's none, right?
No.
You have to help, but there was nothing. So it just comes down and that's it. And I'm involved in other kinds of things, groups of researchers that are supporting other kinds of activity around ODA. Those cuts have been, filtered down very, very quickly at a time when budgets are kind of set, work is maybe starting, and then you've got to go, oh, right, okay, but I've only got 35% of what I thought I was going to have. So yeah, it has a real negative impact. So the sorts of things I'm hearing, which is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, if you go on Twitter, it's just full of there's a really good sort of resources that lots of early career researchers have put together, trying to collect the stories of the ways in which they've been put at risk and the sacrifices they've made to join what is effectively British-led research. And this is ultimately then the British government saying to researchers. So for instance, the latest one I heard is that I think it was a postdoc, somebody who again come in good faith on the basis of this funding, because the funding's been withdrawn, so has their visa.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Of
So
course.
suddenly, exactly, we've got our hostile environment, right? You're literally going to get kicked out. So what are you supposed to? What sort of response? How? That's such a failure in our duty of care to the people that we have invited here, right?
Yeah.
So we've said to this person, please come and join us. Please come and work with us. They've been recruited in good faith. A visa has been issued, and this person has been told that if you don't, you have to leave the country in 2 weeks.
It's devastating.
And how are you supposed to, moving between countries is not easy. Packing up your life and moving somewhere. What is that person?
So costly as well.
It's costly, but even in thinking about what does that person do, right? They may have plowed all their resources into moving here in good faith.
Yeah.
This country then is telling you, oh, the funding's been withdrawn, so has your visa. Where's that person going to live? You can't assume that person has a safety net, that they have family that is looking out for them. So for me, that the sort of the abrogation of that duty of care is sort of happening at so many levels in a way that was entirely predictable. If they had just stopped to ask, we want to make this cut, what would it take? Even if you're going to phase it in over a longer period, not ideal, but at least you're allowing these researchers to plan, to think ahead, for researchers involved, and to make decisions, look for other jobs. So yeah, it's
It seems like everybody plans ahead and everybody behaves in good faith except the government, at this point.
Basically.
Yeah. And it's like, if anyone should know how something kind of plays out at multiple levels and in multiple ways, it's us, right? This is what we do. This is what academics do. This is our job. So if anybody knows about what kind of effects this is having, it's us. But yeah. I mean, that's actually another thing I was gonna mention. This is a boon for bad. Well, no, it's it has a real effect on casualization. I guess it's a real precarity issue in terms of how many research fellowships will have been kind of written into these budgets, how many postdocs will have been hired, like you just mentioned, like both from the UK and from elsewhere, and how many kind of early career researchers, well, like myself, I mean, who will have secured a first postdoc and like a research associate post or a research fellow post on one of these projects, and now the plug on that has been pulled. So that was another thing I wanted to bring up.
Yeah, I mean, it's an excellent and important point, and it is actually a really good illustration of wider problems in higher education, I would say, which is I'm not going to make excuses for the ways in which we go about funding things. It is a problem. right?
Yes.
Now, I get that you have research, you have a pot of money, so, and then you need people to support the delivery of this or that project. So it's almost like in the way that we constitute higher education, the fixed term contracts become almost a necessity. They're built into the model. You
Yeah.
can't actually get around it. Now, I think
How the model
sort of
works.
yeah, exactly. And I think,
Yeah.
you know, there are discussions to be had about the nature of the need for flexibility in labor forces more generally. There's, you know, scholarship that is written by many more clever people than myself that is suggesting that, you know, and that was obviously one of the things that social protection and welfare states were meant to do, was iron out the exigencies of the market, in the labor market. So sort of said that's why you get whatever, some sort of unemployment benefit to see you through. That's fair enough. But it is interesting that, you know, to have an actual default position where fixed term contracts are built into your model, I mean, that does seem problematic. And actually, we're seeing then the sharp end of that decision, right? Which is that when you have an actor like the funder not acting in good faith, you are left with a model that then that sort of highlights and then exacerbates the challenges of that precarity, which anyway was part of UCU's four fights, quite rightly, right? We can't just think it's just pensions or it's just this. They are all connected, right? So pensions are deferred income. I can't have deferred income if I don't have security. And I don't get security because insecurity is built into the way we do HE. So the four fights made a lot of sense in that way. It was very positive in doing that joined up thinking across the ways in which your life course as somebody within HE, all those elements are connected. You know, so then what I'm able to access has equality, has intersectional elements. So it's quite right. That was the right thing. The one thing I would say, at least in this context, is there has been, I mean, certainly in my institution, and I wouldn't want to say that it's, you know, oh, it's great. Leeds has tried hard in this instance, recognize it has been very stressful, and recognizes that saving jobs is a priority. But obviously, the power they have is limited, because the best you can sort of think is, okay, well, we can honor the contract until the end of what it was supposed to be. But a good example is sort of postdocs that are involved in our hub, for instance. The kind of thing that happens in those sorts of big hubs, and again, it highlights not just precarity, but the almost informal way that we can tend to work, which is on a big project like that, you can not expect, but you can hope with a reasonable amount of hope that there's a contract extension built in there somewhere, right? The work never quite finishes on time. There may be an extra
space, right? Yeah,
and you get sort of it is insecure, and the precarity doesn't go away. You know, if you're the postdoc, but that's so much. It is not uncommon. I don't want to say it always happens, but it's not uncommon to be a postdoc on like a big 5-year project like this sorts of hubs that I'm involved in, and then you engage in that. And so we have a postdoc like that. There was every expectation that the work was going to continue, but you can't make that commitment until you get to that tranche of the funding, if that makes sense. You've got to get to the end of an annual year, reassess your budget. That again, but that's what I mean about the precarity is built into the system, which is not right. And the downsides of that precarity built into the system when one actor doesn't act in good faith have now become painfully clear. And that having it again, this is not about just, you know, people in the UK maybe losing jobs. This is about visas. This is about being kicked out of country. This is about livelihoods connected to, you know, people who are the primary breadwinner for their family because they moved here to work on this or that project. So yeah. But you're right, Tilly. The precarity, I mean, in a way, I don't know. The precarity being built in, maybe that's shown that as a gap. Maybe that will help us to make that argument that we really, as a sector, need urgently to address that precarity. Maybe that's a very tiny silver lining. I don't know. But, you know, whatever activism we can muster around the structural basis for precarity, I think that is something we need to be talking about, need to be amplifying that concern. And this has now become a really good case study for why addressing that precarity is so urgent.
Yeah, completely. I think this being thrown into a situation like this, it puts kind of those of us who want an alternative, so those of us who want higher education and society more broadly to be organized differently, it puts us in a real difficult situation, because in order to kind of militate against these cuts that are happening, we kind of end up we might end up kind of defending the status quo, if you see what I mean. We end up kind of replicating what's already there. We end up kind of making out as though what was there in the first place was acceptable, and frankly it isn't. So I feel like this puts us in a difficult position sometimes, because you don't want to kind of be seen to be like, oh, like all of these jobs that used to be there, they're not there anymore. Like this was so good for people because there were jobs there. It's like, well, having a job is, you know, there being jobs there is the bare minimum, isn't it, really? Like, and like, oh, the government sends money overseas, that's good. Like, it's the bare minimum. So
and Tilly, that is actually a super important point, because in a way it gets to the heart of the challenge. For instance, given that we are in a UCU space, it gets to the heart of a challenge for a union like UCU, where it's very difficult to know either which battles to sort of fight, and obviously you want to fight them all, but like that question of, you know, which order do I do this in, or, you know, what's the priority here? How do I prioritize, right?
You have to be careful here to be.
Yeah, exactly. You've got to kind of work out, okay, so for me, my instinct is to, so for instance, just to give you, to sort of put outrage, to layer absurdity onto outrage. There's some inkling in the autumn. Now, this could just be hearsay, or maybe people are trying to be optimistic. I have no idea. Some inkling, and please, anybody who's listening, please don't take this as some confirmation of anything. I genuinely, this is like one of those. This is probably like a rumor, but it's interesting if it does turn out to be true, which is there's some sense that there's a possibility that the autumn spending review could restore some of the money. And it did come out in the, you know, this, it was sort of pitched as a temporary cut because of the extraordinary circumstances. And I think people may be reading into that some of the money could be, but again, this is like, I will go back to just basic unprofessionalism as the case for why the money should be restored, in the sense that there is a debate to be had about how we spend resources. There is a debate to be had about, and a really important conversation that UCU is and needs to continue to be part of, about the ways in which precarity is built into the system. For me, with these cuts, the priority is just to address the unprofessionalism. And you can have both those conversations, which is to say, yes, the system needs to change, but whatever it is that we want to achieve, this cut doesn't actually address any of the issues that we're interested in anyway. And all it's doing is making people who are precarious more precarious. It's putting not only our reputations as universities, as credible research partners, as academics at risk. Again, whatever our views on global Britain, this doesn't make sense for that. So it doesn't make sense for anything that we might to it, even if goals actually ultimately diametrically opposed in the medium to long term. So there's nothing about saying I want this money restored that then commits us to thinking that it should keep working this way. And I think that's the sort of the question that I think is a really challenging thing for activism in this space. So as a trade union, thinking about, it's the sequencing that matters in that. And I'm not saying that it's easy to get that right. But I think the union has taken a good position in the sense that, look, we've got to focus on jobs, which is you'd expect the union to do. But in the sense that the focus on jobs and the restoration of the money doesn't preclude a long-term conversation about the challenges that this form of funding poses for union and union members and the sector more widely in the longer run. And in a way, it's an opportunity that we shouldn't lose to have that conversation alongside we still have to restore that money, because I have to deal with the absolute cliff edge of our members.
The immediate crisis at hand,
Absolutely.
And you have to honour your existing commitments too. I mean, you can't
that is perfect, Tilly. You have to honour your commitments.
Yeah.
We can save the conversation about the way in which we work, which we have to have. But the crisis now is that you have to honour your commitment. And that's the thing that is really, really disappointing. There's not even a conversation to be had with government, that they're being so unwilling to see the damage that it's causing for not a lot of money. It's just not enough money to be having this debate. It's just not. So so there's a sequencing issue, and you're right to point it out, and we mustn't lose sight of it. I totally agree. I think it's good that you raised it, and it has to continue to be a live conversation. We cannot afford to lose sight of that bigger picture. But I think that's the way we do it, which is that we always are qualifying it by saying we don't want to reinforce the system as it is, because we do see that there are challenges. But it's absolutely what you said it really well just then. That question of, you have to honor your commitment. And then we can have a conversation about whether that commitment's the right one. Right. So I think that we can do both those things.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I agree completely. I've just seen there's been a response. I think just before we started streaming, there's a response to the there was a petition for revoke government cuts to global health research, and the government's responded just now, and it says the government remains a champion of global health research. So, this is a quote, I think, and recognises the importance of the UK's contribution. The reduction in ODA for this year is a temporary but necessary measure. So yeah, remains a champion of global health research. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, that's why it's hard not to think that. I mean, again, this isn't about like sinister motives. I just think there is a kind of ideological position that does place itself in that sort of zero-sum Brexity space where you reject ODA almost on principle. And I'm not suggesting for a second there isn't a conversation to be had, although I wouldn't want to have it on those UKIP Brexit terms. No. But certainly there is a sense now that, particularly with the merger of what was DFID into the FCO, so now we've got this FCDO, there's no question they were quite overt about the fact that they did want to realign how ODA was spent.
Yes. I mean, even in the name of, they abolished DFID, right? That was one of, like, within days of the 2019 landslide, painful memories there. There was talk about, we're going to abolish the Department for International Development and International Development, and ODA is going to be in the FCO. So now it's become another government acronym mouthful, which is the FCDO, is it now?
Which is FCDO,
Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And then that kind of realignment away from, it's like you said, like because DFID is kind of emblematic of New Labour, right?
Yes.
And then it becomes, it's the pivot away from aid for aid's sake. And as you say, that's not an unproblematic position to take. But there's a realignment of that towards kind of the UK's foreign and Commonwealth interests. And And I remember the fear that took hold then. Yeah. When it was first suggested that might happen. Yeah. And it obviously it did end up happening.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and it's interesting actually that. Sorry, did you want to? We can move on to something else. But
go ahead.
Just to say that, I mean, on that, it is interesting because obviously one of the things that's been interesting about the story, right? Whatever they Power 97 and DFID sort of followed soon after is one way of realigning ODA, like for British ODA. And I mean, there's always been central deceit in terms of thinking about what aid is for. Again, there is a conversation to be had about that, and it was seen by New Labour, at least partly, as an expression of British soft power. There's no two ways that I don't even think nobody was you would never even get sort of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown like sort of disagreeing with that. But thinking about that soft power in service of some sort of good, and actually in its outward expression. So don't get me wrong, I do think ultimately aid has always been about that. The thing that was interesting is DFID never made that like an open thing. They sort of did try to make it seem as if it was for the greater good in a way that ODA from lots of other countries has been aligned with foreign policy interests quite openly for some time. So Canada's foreign aid, USAID for a large extent, Australia, quite open about the fact that actually aid has to serve domestic interests, whether that's in relation to using domestic service contractors, or whether that's about creating new markets for domestic goods, whatever it is that they're trying to achieve. That's always been fairly out in the open. And I'd say DFID was sort of not that it wasn't, don't get me wrong, it was absolutely about doing that, but they were never so overtly kind of happy to say that that's what it was. What's interesting about the merger of DFID and FCDO then is it is making that explicit. So they are in line with other aid kind of functions in globally, but I don't. It's hard to then tease out whether, because I don't know, I don't have any inside kind of knowledge at all. But it's sort of speculating whether these sorts of cuts are also about trying to facilitate that realignment, right? So whether it's about saying, okay, we want to move, because it could make sense ideologically to say, okay, we don't just need research in the abstract. Like if you were thinking about this, not because it's easy to sort of demonize and go, these are people that don't get it or don't care. But I do think there is a project here. I'm not saying it's very well formed, but if you sort of thought, okay, we want ODA to serve different interests, you might think that just a break is a very quick way to facilitate that realignment in favor of different types of global Britain objectives, whatever they are. So whether that's about saying, okay, well, we do want, climate change, but it has to be about tech that supports British business. We can have a debate about whether that's a good or bad idea, but it's not an entirely unreasonable thing that the government might want to do. Like, I think it's I don't think that's a good thing at all either way, but you can see how that would be a reasonable interpretation of that UKP Brexit position, which is, okay, can I situate ODA commitments, which are in law, so they can't change them without legislation, so they still have to spend it.
Yeah.
But can we do that in a way that is very explicitly speaking to our voters' concerns about what it's spent on? So if we're saying that actually, yeah, we are interested in health, but it's also about whatever, health technology that is British that we export or whatever. Like, there is a kind of, there's a way to explain that isn't, that has a kind of ideological underpinning. And you could in its own terms think, well, yeah, that makes sense. But I think even for me, ultimately, it still comes down to the lack of professionalism in filtering down the cuts. Even if that's what you wanted to do, there was no urgency to do it in a period of 2 weeks.
No, it just seems to me like you say, like, it's not always kind of productive to speculate about these things or to kind of read these sort of very highly orchestrated kind of sinister motives in. But I mean, this government is like, it's plainly ideological in how and we mentioned this earlier, in how they they present everything as a zero-sum game. They pit groups against one another, say, well, if you're winning, if they're winning, then you must be losing. And if they get something, that means you haven't got it. And it means they want to take it away from you, whatever that is. But then also they're just so, I think you got it with the unprofessional, with the lack of professionalism. They're just kind of, also just so sloppy in how in the way that they deal with stuff. It's like, on the one hand, it's they're highly ideological, and on the other, they're just sort of incompetent. But I think those things are never separable. I kind of like, I think these things are always partly about incompetence and just kind of apathy and just a lack of care, I suppose, like a lack of concern and a lack of forethought and a lack of sort of putting themselves in other people's positions. And
no, I think that's a really nice way to put it, Tilly. It's a lack of care. I think for them, this is just not a priority. And actually, they, as you said yourself, I mean, they've got a majority. They won a landslide. They have the right to say that it's not a priority. But as we've already talked about, what's clear is that it does contradict commitments to things like global Britain. So even on its own terms, it doesn't quite make sense.
Incoherent on its own terms.
Exactly. And I think ultimately for me, to take account of, sort of, if sort of summarize, to take account of your concern about ending up inadvertently reinforcing a system that is actually creating precarity, which is something that we cannot afford to lose sight of. And I think it's really good that you highlighted that, because we can't afford to lose sight of it. It's absolutely right. There is still that sense that on its own terms, it doesn't quite make sense. That's the thing that I've just struggled with. It's like, okay, fine, you're ideologically not committed to aid. Fine, you want an 80-seat majority. Actually, that's your right. Fair enough. If that's what you think that's what you think you were elected to do, you don't represent me because I didn't vote for you. But I get that lots of people did, and that's maybe how you're interpreting what they want. That is the democracy that we have, and there are debates about how democratic our democracy is and blah blah blah, but whatever, if that's how they're interpreting it, it's ultimately what you said. It's the lack of care, which is, you wanted to have that discussion. Actually, don't be a bad faith actor. Have a discussion with us about what that looks like. Actually take some advice. There are people, as I said, willing to have a discussion about aid. But that isn't even the direction that they want to go, because I think that point you've made is absolutely spot on. It's the sloppiness, it's the lack of care. And I think what's heartbreaking about that is it's completely unnecessary. As a sector, we're not full of, there are people that, have different views ideologically about this. But by and large, I think, particularly in this space, lots of people are willing to work with you. We recognize we're in it. HE has been in it, right? We know we're in a crisis. We're all living with it. So if that means that there's something that we've got to do to sort of try to be supportive of a new status quo, there's nobody that wouldn't have that conversation. But I think it's a bad faith conversation, as I said, given that actually lots and lots of other things have had money thrown at them, and this just doesn't seem to save money that is worth that actually leads to any sort of particular outcome. I just don't see what 120 million pounds on the scale of things for this government, for the size of this economy, I don't know what it achieves. But 120 million pounds cut, and for cuts to have to be found in a period of sort of 2 to 4 weeks on 17 million pound projects that span 5 countries, where, I mean, it just seems it seems like a ludicrous way to function. It's not. It doesn't really make sense. And so that in the end is where we're left, is just the kind of the sadness of what we've lost. And as you say, it's the lack of care. They don't actually care that we've lost those things. And in a way, why don't they care? That is the question. I don't know why they don't care. I don't have an answer to that.
No. I wonder I don't know what the likelihood is of a kind of U-turn on this. I mean, this government's got a record of U-turns, but I'm surprised that they haven't kind of, because I think I've seen the strategy that the kind of leaders of academic research in the UK have taken, like the head of the Wellcome Trust has been warning, sort of saying, well, you know what, like, you can do this if you want, but the UK will never be a kind of, what term did he use? He said, it'll never be a science superpower. And also note the kind of highlighting of science as opposed to other things. But it'll never be a science superpower if you go down this road. And I think I can see what they're doing there. They're kind of appealing. It's the old trick of kind of, if you want to win someone round, kind of appeal to their vanity. Which is what happens. It's like, well, you know, you why are you doing this? I know you care about research. Look, what's happening here? Like, I know you care about being a science superpower. But also, I think that's a problematic framing of this. This isn't about whether the UK is a superpower, like, or at least it's not. You know, it's not for me, and it's not for a kind of, I guess, a lot of the people that I would associate with. So, I guess, like, I don't know. I'm wondering how we can kind of resist that framing, if that's going to be the dominant one, because if people have picked that out as the kind of the most likely one that's going to make them reconsider, you know, like, but so in the way we've got to kind of collude in it a bit, but also not.
No, it's a really good point you raise, and I suppose in the end, the one thing I would say about the pushback has been the collective nature of it, and I suppose there are sort of good trade union principles that underpin that, which I think are very welcome, and ultimately, you know, we do have to resist that, right? There will be some academics that are keen to be a part of a science superpower. We mustn't sort of just think that all academics are also sort of selfless and engaged in these projects for the greater good.
And for the record, science is crucial as well. Like, I'm not doing down science because I.
I didn't hear it that way at all. No. But what I mean is that you're quite right. I think that by and large, the people that are themselves scientists, say, in these spaces, are acting in good faith. I think that is a fair observation. There will be. I suppose what I'm trying to say is there may be some people in this space in academia who don't reject the idea of Britain being recognized as a science superpower. But I think by and large, there is a sense that you can't really do things on your own. I think there's one thing that is probably a shared value in HE, although we are not necessarily incentivized to behave that way. It's becoming more of a norm to sort of think that actually it is valuable to work with other people, and we are being incentivized to work with interdisciplinary and partnerships and all of that. And it would be good to see that becoming more of the norm, you know, shared publications, et cetera, et cetera. So there's something about that. I mean, but you're quite right. We have to resist the framing. In a way, if they did restore the money, though, the more immediate problem is that the damage is already being done.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
the trust has already been shattered, right?
Yeah, because actually what they basically said is, okay, we might give you some money back, which shows a complete lack of understanding of how these funded projects even work.
They probably don't even know how they work.
Our in-country partners say, okay, well, I've got to find 70% cut. Well, I've got to let this person go. You can't suddenly think, I'm going to hire that person back. People aren't just sitting around twiddling their thumbs waiting to be rehired.
No.
It is crazy. I suppose the only other thing I would say about that is, yes, we have to collectively resist that kind of framing, because it goes against the nature of the sort of collaborations that have been driving a lot of the work under the GCRF umbrella.
Yeah.
And I think if that's how it ends up going through, we would then have to think about how we articulate a message, or we just continue to sort of do what we're doing and ignore the messaging. But again, whether that means that, you know, you'd have to sign up to that messaging to get the money. I mean, it is an interesting question. I don't have an answer to that, but I think it's a really important point that you make, because if the nature of that sort of intellectual space is realigned in favor of sort of great power articulations,
which completely writes out all of the collaborations as well. You know, like, the most important point is that if you say the UK is a superpower, that just paints out of the picture all of the partnerships that the whole thing is supposed to be about from the beginning.
No, it's a really good point, Tilly. I wish I had an answer for you, or even something moderately thoughtful to say about it. But all I can say is, yes, I agree. You know, it is something we need to keep an eye on. Basically, I completely agree. It may be the way that's going to get reimagined, and that may be coming down the pike, and we are going to have to work out what we do about it, if and when it ever comes to pass, I guess, is the best we can do.
I think what we have to do, I mean, this is just me talking now. Like, I think we have to always be better than they are, I think. Yeah. And so we say the government doesn't care, and they don't. You know, it looks like the government doesn't care about relationships, about kind of people's jobs, about people's lives, about sacrifices people made, about people's time, about people's expertise. We have to care more. You know, we have to always go one higher and kind of say, well, no, we're just because they don't care, we're not going to stop caring. So I suppose, like, if we're going to wrap up on a hopeful note, that might be one to.
Yeah, I agree, and I think in a way, seeing UCU being active in this space has been reassuring in that sense, because that is also what trade unions are for. And I think it's an important reminder that, you know, there's a tendency, I think, to think about trade unions in a way very often sort of caricatured in the media, sort of very narrowly focused on, like, you know, workers' rights,
militancy.
Fair enough, but that actually there is a wider kind of intellectual basis for why you might do that, and that certainly as a higher education trade union, inserting ourselves in a way that highlights the intellectual project that underpins why collective organizing matters is really important. And I think, although it's not a silver lining, because obviously the cuts are just bad, and as I said, for me, it's the human cost, right? Whether we're going to help to meet the SDGs, I mean, that's kind of also important. But for me, it's the human cost, and what you've said, the language of the lack of care, I think is a really nice way to put it. And the lack of professionalism around the management of these cuts is what I'm finding really hard to take. But there is a sense that actually the union does have a role in thinking about our shared intellectual project, our shared intellectual commons. What is lost intellectually, you know, in terms of our shared understanding and growth, and what do we lose when these funding cuts? And I think those are things that unions are, you know, kind of, it's not just, it is about precarity in workers, and we mustn't lose sight of that. But there's a shared intellectual project as well. And I think UCU being in the space is positive from that point of view, which is that we need to be having that joined up thinking across. They're not separate things. They're absolutely, one underpins the other for sure. So that's, you know, if it brings us together to fight harder, well, maybe that's the small silver lining. I don't know.
I think that's a really good way to finish. Thanks so